Everyone's here. Welcome to our roadmap to reopening schools. I'm Brian Jordan, Deputy Director of Kansas Association of School Boards. With us today, we have Angie Stallbaumer, our Assistant Executive Director for Legal Services.
I'll do whatever you want.
Yeah, well, you can jump in anytime you want. And then with us, we also have Buie. He's the Executive Director of USA. So we wanted to put together a session that gives you some things to think about and start to discuss around your board tables back home. Within your leadership teams back home. As we go through this process today, we're really going to encourage you not to lock yourself into any concrete plans, but we want you to think about what ifs, also start thinking about what are next steps for communication and trying to build a process so that you can be ready to respond in the coming weeks as the State Department of Education starts to release information and starts to put some guidance out for schools. Most of you, I'm sure, have been on a Zoom meeting here recently, but just a quick reminder of the steps we're going to be going through, or not the steps we're going to go through, but the tools that we're going to be using in that. In the lower left-hand corner is your mute button. We're going to use some breakouts throughout the session today. So when we drop you into your breakout rooms, you're going to be with a smaller group of 6 or 7 people. Make sure you turn your video on. It's a little easier to have that conversation if you actually have your video turned on. We also have the chat feature open. We're going to ask that you post your questions as we go throughout the day in the chat feature. Also, when you come out of the breakout rooms, we're going to give you some criteria, and we're going to have you appoint somebody to put the key thoughts or key ideas or key questions in that chat feature as we go along throughout the session today. So as we started to put this together, what we really wanted to think about is what are the critical messages that school leaders and board members across the state need to be thinking about as they start to look at reopening schools here in less than a couple of months. So how we arrived at these critical messages, our staff here at KASB, along with GA staff at US came together and started talking about what we were hearing from our members, also what we were seeing from leadership standpoints. And these were kind of the 3 critical messages that we talked about all leaders need to be thinking about. Understand that there is no way for us to predict today what it's going to look like 2 months from now when schools reopen. When you think about where we were at 3 months ago, no one would have predicted where we're at today. So trying to think about putting a concrete plan in place for 2 months from now is almost impossible. But the process of developing that plan is critical. As you plan that, or you go through that process of developing the plan, you're building some relationships with key people. You're establishing channels of communication. You're also starting to figure out what expertise or what insights other folks bring to the conversation as you work through that planning process. We've also encouraged folks to not look at this situation as it's somebody else's fault that we've been shut down. It's somebody else's issue, but look at this as an opportunity. As you all are fully aware, we want to continue to improve schools in the state of Kansas. This is a great opportunity for us to look at some of those long-held traditions, things we've always done, and maybe do them slightly different and in a better way for our students. And then finally, the third thing that we believe is critical as we go forward is that idea of patience and being flexible. As I just said, no one would have predicted where we are today. We've had to be flexible. When schools got closed in March, we had to very quickly put together a continuous learning plan and be flexible with how that plan was executed and how our staff executed that plan. That's going to be important going forward as well. So as you're sitting there at that board table, or as you're trying to lead that district, always start from that mindset of how can we be patient and how can we be flexible as we go forward into the next few months. The next piece that we want to touch on is kind of what are the key things that we need to be thinking about from a board governance standpoint or a leadership standpoint. On the right side of the screen there are kind of what we call the 7 authorities or 7 powers that a board has for governing the system. Well, we know that the world we're operating in right now looks a little different than the typical time that we use those 7 authorities or 7 powers. So here again, that flexibility piece is going to be critical. So when you're thinking about goals and priorities that you've had over the last several years in your district, take a step back and talk about where those currently are and what we need to adjust to make those actually a reality or base them on the current reality. We also know that our handbooks were written for a brick and mortar setting with kids being in the school every single day and managing that process. What pieces and parts of those handbooks are we going to have to look at that we may have to have some flexibility, we may have to temporarily have some adjustments on those policies. And that's one of the areas in recent conversations with board members. This is why you need to have the conversation today and not wait till late July and August. So what are those things that we need to hold on to and make sure they're still a key part of our policy and the direction that we're going forward, so that when the world starts to shift, as it most likely will, how can we make sure that those things are maintained as we go throughout the process? Another key piece of this is that reallocation of resources. As you all are fully aware out there, it was not cheaper to operate the schools the last few weeks, but we know we still have to purchase the things that we need for school to be successful. There's also some CARES money that's now come into your systems. How is that money going to be used within your districts? So that's another reason you need to have some conversations, so you can kind of, where are we at currently with what we spent to finish up school? What CARES money is coming in that we're going to need to reallocate or use to make sure that we've got the safety precautions and steps in place? And now how are we going to go forward and make sure that we're putting resources where they need to be for the system that we want for our kids? And then finally, the adjustments to contracts. And so this is one of those areas where we're just kind of getting into the negotiation season. I was just on a call this afternoon with some superintendents, and they're starting to think about, okay, what adjustments are we going to have to make to contracts if we're going to start in a remote learning environment in the fall, or if we're going to have to run a dual system that has remote learning happening alongside the traditional brick and mortar schools. Many of you put together MOUs with your teaching groups out there, your negotiating groups. Those might be some good places to start and kind of unpack, how did that MOU work? What were the barriers we ran into? Did those really accommodate what we needed for our kids to have a system that worked? So here's kind of some key steps for setting the stage. And these are some initial things that we think would be a great conversation to have around your board table. And this is a conversation where you're not trying to make critical decisions at this point, but you're trying to really do some reflection. Where are we currently at? What worked well over the last several months of school? What do we need to hold on to? What do we need to let go? What do we need to kind of rethink to make sure that when we launch into school in August, we're ready to address some of those things that we wish we could have done better in the last few months of school. Another area to consider for conversation is, what staffing or operational challenges did you face? So we know many of you fed a lot of families and a lot of kids, but you didn't transport kids. But in the fall, you're going to need to transport kids. What did we learn from kind of a social distancing, different model of feeding kids that we could translate into some other areas of our system and use that going forward? How did you use staff differently to accommodate the continuous learning plans that you put in place? Are there pieces there that we could continue to do with the remote learning that's going to happen or possibly happen in the fall, that we've learned how to use those staff and maximize their experiences and also their expertise? And probably one of the most difficult pieces or questions up here on the screen to ask is, how did you measure student success in meeting outcomes? We know that many districts provided a lot of grace and a lot of flexibility in measuring their student success in the spring semester. We believe, and KSDE has affirmed, that there's not going to be a lot of grace given to you on the student success piece. You're going to have some pieces in place to make sure students are progressing. We've all talked about this for hours, and we sense that parents probably aren't going to have as much patience as well with some of the things that we did in continuous learning. So how are we going to make sure that we've got those accountability pieces in place? We have methods to monitor our students' growth and improvement going forward. And then finally, a question to talk about is, what feedback have we received from our stakeholders? Now, many of your districts did surveys during the continuous learning that ask simple questions of what resources do you need, what's working well, what's not working well. Take some time to unpack that. So as you put your plans together for the fall semester, what can we again build on and use as we go into that fall semester? So we believe those are some key questions that you need to be talking about now before KSDE puts out some of their guidance in mid-July. July 10th is the actual date when it starts to get out there. There's going to be some guidance out there, but what do we know worked well for us, or what do we know we need to adjust and change going forward? So we told you we'd put you in some breakout rooms today. So this is going to be your first opportunity to have some conversation with your fellow board members. Just a couple of reminders when you go into that breakout room. Take a moment to turn on your camera, unmute yourself. Make sure you introduce yourselves around the breakout room. obviously what district you're from, what role you're playing in that district, because we have a mixed group on here today of superintendents, leaders, as well as board members. And then the person who has the highest USD number is going to be the person that has to put their comments in the chat when you come out of the breakout room. So that person, once you get into the breakout room, if you're USD 450 and you're the highest on the list, you're going to be expected to put a couple ideas or thoughts in the chat when you come out, just so we can kind of get a sense of what you talked about and kind of see some themes that emerge from your chat conversation. So I'm going to ask Dr. Hart to put you in your breakout rooms. You'll have about 10 minutes for this conversation in your breakout room. Everybody's back, it looks like, from your breakout rooms. So remind you that the person with the highest USD number in your chat room needs to kind of add the key points or discussion items from your chat or from your discussion into the chat. I'm going to pop the screen back up here and start sharing again. I'm going to turn it over to Angie, let her talk a little bit about planning for safety of students. So Angie.
All right. Well, I think one message we all wanted to get across is we met as a staff trying to help people through a time that's really unnerving because people have so much to plan for and feel like they don't have all the right information to do that. We know that the State Department of Education is going to come forward with guidance, and we know that's coming at us on July 10th. So what we've discussed as staffs working together was that there are some things that you can do, homework that you can do now, having those discussions that you just had, learning from those scenarios that you were put into. And as Dr. Jordan said earlier, we need to look at this as an opportunity, because I think a lot of districts had some of these ideas that were just out there in the distance that they weren't able to implement, and they were put into an environment where those, hey, maybe someday we could, plans turned into actual things that were put into gear and used. So what we are encouraging you to do is think about what's going to happen on July 10th more as something that's going to give you parameters for how you're going to move forward, but it's probably not going to be guidance that's going to tell you exactly what to do. And so I think there's an understanding that no one size fits all plan is going to work in moving forward, because you're all districts with different needs and different publics and all of those things. So what we want you to do is really reflect on what you've learned and what you discussed, and really try to put that in place in moving forward. So we also know that the environment's going to change, because through legislative action, the actions of the governor have been limited more than they were this spring. So there's probably not a great likelihood that the governor will order a shutdown.
Right.
So this is going to take all of those decisions that were happening at the state level and make them much more local. So what you really need to do is talk to your parents, talk to your staff. What worked, what didn't work? What were you satisfied with? What were the challenges when you tried to implement these plans? And how can we fix those? Are there tweaks?
I think another thing that we note today is going to happen is you will have families that are not willing to send their kid back to school for fear of contracting the virus. You're also going to have staff that are fearful of coming back in that environment, and so you need to kind of unpack those scenarios and be ready to respond. We had a forum this week with our HR payroll people, and that question came up: how do we respond if we have a staff member that doesn't want to come back but doesn't necessarily qualify under the modified FMLA guidelines that have been adopted at the federal level? So having some conversations now kind of puts you in a better position to make that decision without the pressure and the intensity of the moment when that would happen.
And asking those questions now rather than waiting until later on.
Yeah.
Because people are going to have an idea what they're going to feel. Those feelings aren't going to change. Circumstances may change, but the feelings aren't going to change.
Right. There's been a lot of conversation at the state level with the superintendents and discussion among superintendents. They know right now there's a percentage of families that are not going to send their kids back. Right. Talking and discussing that around the board table and as a leadership team is an important conversation, so that you can be ready to build out a dual system or a remote learning plan for families that aren't ready to come back.
And we had some interesting discussions when we talked about surveying and talking to parents, and that you have to be really careful how you ask the questions. But how you ask the questions really matters, because it's by thinking that you are only getting them to communicate with you, you're actually communicating with them. So the way you phrase it, if you put all of the, if you make it sound like, would you be willing to come back to school if we had school on site in the fall, that's essentially saying, hey, everyone, it's optional. And so you need to be really thoughtful about how those decisions are made, and very meticulous in how you plan those communications or those information gathering. And so a resource on our staff, if you want to talk to somebody about that, Dr. Marsha Wiesman is a very good resource, so you can look to her for information. Ted Carter on our staff would be very good as far as that.
There's also been some discussion started in districts around how are you changing your enrollment process and procedure? Are you shifting the start of school forward or back? Those are some conversations that folks are having. Those are all great conversations to have now, and not having to make decisions on them, but talking about what ifs, talking about what could it look like if we did enrollment differently. We've always traditionally done a couple of days on site. What if we went to a more remote process for that?
PD is another example. You can have those conversations with your negotiating team now. If you're going to try to front load PD or try to add a day or two, you don't have to wait. You know you're going to need those items. So as much as that can be taken care of today, take care of it today.
Great advice.
And this is a time you're really going to need to lean on your neighbors and your stakeholders. And so this slide that we have in front of you here just really makes you think about who all do you need to consult on this? Because if the decisions are made at a countywide basis, whether to open or not, there's going to have to be some working between you and county health, between the districts within each county.
So build that relationship now. So as you go to the county and say, here's kind of what we're planning for remote learning and activities and handling these situations that we all deal with in school. It's a lot easier to have an open, honest conversation now than it is when you're in the heat of the moment of having to open school in 5 days. So we're going to give you another opportunity to go into your breakout rooms to talk a little bit more around what steps has your district taken to establish relationship with your key stakeholders being families, students, community leaders. So think county commissions, think county health officials, think city commissions, other groups or entities that you may have pulled into the conversation to help. I heard a conversation today with the superintendent talking about some of the local churches offering up space for classrooms or groups of students to meet if they have to spread out across the community because of social distancing. So Dr. Hart's going to put you back into your breakout rooms, give you another 10 minutes to talk about key stakeholders. This time when you get in your breakout room, the person with the lowest USD number is going to be the person that has to report in the chat. So you might double check your USD numbers when you get back in there. And when you come out, we'll ask you to post your thoughts in the chat. We will make all of this available after the session today, so you can kind of see a summary of what was discussed. Dr. Hart? Conversation. Reminder, the person with the lowest USD number now is the designated reporter in the chat feature. Again, we'll post everything that you've put out there today, so you can come back and look at this at a later time. So let's get back to our content here. I'm going to flip this one over to GA to talk a little bit about, not quite that far, let me go back. There we go. We're going to talk a little bit about student success and what are some of those things that we should be thinking about as we start to think about students being successful in our system.
Well, I think the one thing that we know for sure is there's going to be multiple ways for students to learn. I mean, we've got, I think everybody agrees that we're going to be in-house at some point in time, earlier the better probably, but we're also going to have to develop a remote learning mechanism of some piece. We learned today that there is a mechanism on September 20th to measure those kids and have those kids be counted, which I know has been a big concern for everybody. But I think that piece in the middle is that blended model. What does it look like if we have to alternate days, or if we have to alternate class sizes, or whatever that looks like, in developing that blended model? So I think as we look at on-site instruction, does that look as traditional as it always has, or do we need to do things differently? When we look at remote learning, what we did in the spring, was it successful? How did we measure that? And can we put that forward, or do we need to completely rehaul it, do something different, or ask for advice? Because probably going to be different expectations with the remote learning. And do we have the technology and the infrastructure? to make that work.
Kind of goes back to that initial discussion that they had around, the 4 areas operationally from a personnel standpoint. How do we manage that? Infrastructure wise, what worked well, what didn't. I agree with you completely that I think blended learning is going to have the reality that we're dealing with. Some districts I know have offered up summer school this summer, and they said it was amazing how many families were interested in summer school. So you have some families that are eager to come back, but you also talk to folks out there in the field and they're saying, we have families that have told us right now, we're not coming back. So you're going to have to plan for that. So we wanted to give you a little bit of an opportunity here, another short conversation in your breakout rooms to reflect on these 3 questions that you see up here. What actions do you anticipate taking to open safely on site? So you may be opening on site, but you still need to take into account social distancing and people's fear, not only students, but also staff. Remote instruction, the question is, what did you learn this spring and how will that help ensure student success going forward? Again, keeping in mind that accountability piece and measuring their progress. And then finally, how might it look different with a combination of those 2, on-site and remote learning? So we're going to put you back into your breakout rooms for some quick conversation around those 3 pieces. Again, we can't emphasize enough, it's not about defining a structure today, but it's about what are possibilities, what are things that we've learned going forward. So Dr. Hart. All right, welcome back from your breakouts. Hopefully it was a productive conversation about different learning opportunities for students and discussing the continuum that we're going to have in the fall. I failed miserably at one task that I had on that slide, which was to assign somebody to put some comments in the breakout related to your discussion around the different learning opportunities that you're going to put in place, hopefully, or that you should be considering as you put things in place for your students in the fall. So we have one more slide to get through this afternoon. And this one is about communicating the message. So as we started off the conversation today, we really said there were 3 things that we want you to keep in mind. The critical piece is planning is an important part. The plan itself is probably going to be changed as we get down the road because of the unknowns that we're going to have to face. Another piece of that is we have to avoid the blame. Look at this as an opportunity for us to improve our system, think about those things that went really well and met the needs of some families and some kids, and how do we build on those as we go forward. And then the final piece of that is remain flexible and have some patience. We know it's going to be a trying time going forward. A lot of traditions are probably not going to be able to happen the way they've always done with our schools. And so keep those things in mind as you're communicating with your families. So the last piece that we want to talk a little bit about today is make sure that you're engaging your stakeholders, those families, the community, those local decision makers. Make sure you're using your channels to do that. What we like to tell folks, communication involves 2 steps. It's out as well as in. So how are you going to get some feedback after you've put the information out there? And then make sure that you're doing it frequently. People know where to access that information. So we're going to give you just a short little breakout to share ideas around how you're using, or not what you're using, or how you're using the different platforms to inform your parents, public, and staff around things that are happening over the summer, anticipating the restart of school. So when you come back this time, I'm gonna lean on the highest USD number again in your breakout rooms to put some ideas in the chat that you're doing to keep your families informed. So this will be a short one, just so we can hit the 2:15 time frame. Give you about 3 or 4 minutes in your breakout room, then we'll bring you back. I apologize, we had to shorten that one up a little bit. We're running up against our hour with all of you this afternoon. We're going to launch a quick little poll here to give us some feedback on what are next steps for you all. What would you like to have some further discussion about related to this topic of reopening schools? We want to make sure that we're being intentional with your time and giving you the opportunity to discuss with your colleagues and with fellow board members what your steps are. The second question that we want to give you a poll on, or a chance to give us some feedback on, is how frequently do you want these sessions to happen? We know that July 10th is a critical date because the State Department's going to give us some guidance. I can't emphasize enough, it's guidance that's going to have to be unpacked at the local level and to make sense of it and see how it fits in with your local discussions and plans. So I'm going to let you guys continue to work on the poll questions. Final thoughts from you two.
I think that my final thought would be just this. I think the best thing you can do right now is communicate. Make sure you communicate with your stakeholders, your families, your parents. Even if you're not doing a lot, you're waiting for the release on July 10th, let your families know what the status is of the plan, because they're trying to make plans, trying to make decisions. So keep that line of communication open.
Right. And I would say just to plan for flexibility. I think you should probably have some ideas and some planning done on each of those instructional models, just because you don't know, even if you go all on site, you need to be prepared to switch to a different model if your health situation in the county changes. And you also need to be ready to accommodate those students or those staff members that aren't able to be there. So
good points. Reminder, if you were the highest USD number from the last breakout room, put your final thoughts or comments related to how you're communicating or methods that you're using to communicate with your stakeholders. We appreciate you getting on with us this afternoon for this opportunity to discuss the steps that you're considering or thinking about as you get ready to reopen schools in the fall. We look forward to seeing you all at another session down the road. And thank you, Angie. Thank you, GA, for coming in this afternoon. And we'll see you all later. Have a good afternoon.